Have you ever wondered what it takes to kill an immortal hero? Imagine a world where the fans decided the life or death of the heroes with a simple phone call, where a purple titan erased half of the universe long before the MCU existed, and where a billionaire in armor was fighting his own demons in a bottle. This is not just the history of comics, it is the story of how children's books became the biggest cultural phenomenon of the 20th century. To understand how we got here, we have to travel back in time. 1975. The world is changing. Vietnam is over. Jaws dominates the box office. And in the comic shops, something is about to revolutionize everything. What you're about to see are the 25 years that changed the way we tell stories. Part 1. The 70s. The birth of a mutant era. Giant-size X-Men. 1975. When Len Wein and Dave Cockrum created Giant-size X-Men. 1. No one imagined that they were sowing the seeds of an empire. This legendary issue not only gave us icons like Storm, Colossus, and Nightcrawler, but also brought Wolverine to the mutant team, a decision that would change the history of Marvel forever. Although the X-Men were born from the mind of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby in 1963, it was this publication that catapulted them to fame, paving the way to make them rivals to Spider-Man as Marvel's most popular series. Without this revolutionary comic, we would have never had the legendary Uncanny X-Men series, the memorable cartoons of the 90s, or Hugh Jackman bringing the immortal Logan to life on the big screen. 1976. Superman vs. The Amazing Spider-Man is co-published by DC and Marvel. While DC and Marvel haven't always played well over the years, they managed to put their differences aside for a while in 1976 thanks to the almighty dollar. Superman vs. The Amazing Spider-Man was a historic crossover for the two greats and set the stage for regular collaborations in the following years. Written by industry legend Jerry Conway and drawn by Ross Andru, who had worked for both DC and Marvel up to that point. Superman vs. The Amazing Spider-Man managed to delight fans of both the Man of Steel and the Head of the Web alike. Without the 1976 crossover, fans would have never been introduced to the likes of the Uncanny X-Men and the new Teen Titans or JLA, Avengers, the Judge, the Jury, and the Executioner. Judge Dredd debuts 1977 as Marvel celebrated the release of Marvel Comics Super Special, one featuring Kiss as superheroes. A more enduring legend was being born in the pages of the British magazine 2000 AD. Judge Dredd. This ruthless street judge, with the power to arrest, sentence, and execute criminals on the spot, became the longest-lived character in the publication and an icon that transcended the comic. His influence reached Hollywood with two film adaptations, Judge Dredd in 1995 and Dredd in 2012, proving that the instant justice of Mega City 1 had a universal appeal that would last for decades. Part 2. The Age of Experimentation. The Great Collapse. The implosion of DC 1978. Although 1978 saw the memorable encounter between Superman and Muhammad Ali, the real headline was the devastating DC implosion. What started as an ambitious DC explosion with 57 new titles, more pages per comic and high prices, ended in a business disaster. In its attempt to compete with Marvel, DC overestimated its capabilities, and by June 1978 was forced to cancel 40% of its publications and lay off much of its staff. Ironically, when the dust settled, DC was publishing fewer titles than before its expansion, marking one of the darkest moments in the publisher's history. Iron Man's personal demon. Demon in a Bottle, 1979. While Frank Miller began his legendary stage in Daredevil, Tony Stark faced his own demons in the historical Demon in a Bottle. David Michelinie and Bob Layton created a revolutionary story that explored the millionaire playboy's alcoholism, humanizing the Iron Man like never before. Layton's iconic cover, featuring a disheveled Stark gazing at himself in the mirror next to a bottle of alcohol, became a defining image of the character, and his battle with addiction would remain a crucial element of his narrative for decades, influencing stories such as Avengers Disassembled and Tony Stark. Iron Man. Part 3. The Dark Revolution. The Dark Phoenix Rises. The Dark Phoenix Saga 1980. Chris Claremont and John Byrne's Dark Phoenix Saga revolutionized comics by transforming Jean Grey, a member of the X-Men, into an uncontrollable cosmic force. This story, so powerful that it was even referenced in Stranger Things, transcended the superhero genre to become a parable about power and humanity. Despite its two film adaptations, X-Men, The Last Stand and Dark Phoenix, the emotional impact of the original comic remains unmatched. As Will Friedwald pointed out in Vanity Fair, the saga resonated with readers because, at its core, it wasn't about superheroes or mutants, but about human nature itself. The future that shouldn't be. Days of Future Past, 1981. The magical duo of Chris Claremont and John Byrne shone again with Days of Future Past, a dystopian story that revolutionized the X-Men comics in just 2 issues. This saga, which follows mutants in a devastating future where they are persecuted and confined in internment camps, achieved in 44 pages what many stories do not achieve in years: to change the rules of the game. As Abraham Reisman pointed out in Vulture, it became one of the most influential stories in the medium, inspiring even the hit movie X-Men. Days of Future Past in 2014, and proving that sometimes the shortest stories are the ones that leave the deepest mark. A Hero's Farewell, the death of Captain Marvel, 1982. At a time when comics only existed in single issues, Marvel revolutionized the industry with The Death of Captain Marvel, his first graphic novel. This pioneering work narrated the touching ending of Mar-Vell, who succumbed to cancer in a raw and realistic way, without the usual tricks or resurrections so common in comics. As James Hoare pointed out in Sci-Fi Now, this decisive moment showed a powerful cosmic hero facing and accepting a slow and inglorious death, thus marking a before and after in the narrative maturity of the medium. The Visual Revolution, Ronin by Frank Miller, 1983. After his acclaimed stint in Daredevil, Frank Miller made the leap to DC Comics with Ronin, a bold fusion of samurai and cyberpunk that followed a Japanese feudal warrior trapped in a sword for 8 centuries, until his liberation in a futuristic New York. The series not only proved that DC was willing to take creative risks, as Ben McCool pointed out in Technology Times, it revolutionized the very format of comics with its deluxe paper and 48 ad-free pages per issue, setting a new standard for the industry. The First Great War, Marvel Superheroes Secret Wars, 1984. Before mass crossovers became commonplace, Marvel revolutionized the industry with Secret Wars, an event that brought together Earth's mightiest heroes and villains in Battleworld on the whim of the enigmatic Beyonder. Although today she is remembered mainly for giving Spider-Man his iconic black suit, this series, born from a collaboration with Mattel Toys, laid the foundations for the future of comics. Secret Wars became the progenitor of all Moderna crossover events, forever transforming the way publishers would tell their great stories. The End of Infinity, Crisis on Infinite Earths, 1985. After 50 years of a tangled continuity, DC Comics undertook its most ambitious event with Crisis on Infinite Earths, a saga that shook the foundations of its universe. Unlike Marvel's Secret Wars, this crisis had permanent consequences. The Anti-Monitor villain destroyed multiple parallel Earths, and iconic heroes such as Supergirl and the Flash perished in battle, although they would eventually return. The impact of this series was so profound that even decades later it inspired an eponymous crossover event in the CW's DC series in 2019, proving that some crises never lose their relevance. The Dark Knight Returns. The Dark Knight Returns, 1986. Frank Miller revolutionized the image of Batman forever with The Dark Knight Returns, definitely moving him away from the camp tone of Adam West's series of the 60s. This dark reimagining of the aging hero, which included his legendary battle against Superman, not only spawned multiple sequels and an animated adaptation, but also inspired Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice in 2016. As Miller confessed to the Washington Post, he wanted the bad guy, Batman, to beat the superpowered schoolboy, thus setting up a new, bleaker era for the Dark Knight. The Doomsday Clock, Watchmen 1987. Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen transcended the world of comics to become a literary masterpiece, being the only graphic novel included in Time's list of the 100 best novels in English. As noted by Lev Grossman, her ruthless psychological realism and cinematic narrative made her an evolutionary landmark of the medium. His influence endures to this day, spawning prequels, film adaptation, and an acclaimed HBO series, proving that some stories are truly timeless. The Deadly Democracy, A Death in the Family, 1988. A Death in the Family marked an unprecedented moment in comic book history when DC put the fate of Jason Todd, the second Robin, in the hands of readers. Through a telephone line, fans voted for the life or death of the young hero, with 343 votes in favor of his death against 271 for his survival. This innovative form of interaction with readers, which resulted in Robin's brutal murder at the hands of the Joker, demonstrated the power of fandom to directly influence the narrative, setting a unique precedent in the comic book industry. The era of mega events, Acts of Vengeance, 989. Secret Wars introduced the crossovers, and Crisis elevated them to a new level. Acts of Vengeance foreshadowed the future of mass publishing events, spanning an astonishing 71 issues across multiple series, an impressive feat for the pre-internet era. While not the most set the model for future mega events like Secret Wars 2015 and its 230 issues. Marvel demonstrated that readers were willing to follow increasingly long and complex stories, laying the foundation for the Moderna era of publishing events. Part 4. The 90s. Everything changes. The Art of the Revolution. Spider-Man. 1 by McFarlane, 1990. Todd McFarlane shook up the comic book industry when his Spider-Man, with its multiple variant covers, sold over 2.5 million copies. Although his writing was not as acclaimed as his art, this success marked a turning point that would lead McFarlane and other prominent artists, such as Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld, to found Image Comics. Despite its difficult beginnings in the 90s, Image would consolidate itself as the third most important publisher in the market, only behind Marvel and DC, redefining the role of independent creators in the industry. 1991. Thanos collects the Infinity Stones. In the Infinity Gauntlets, in 1991, while Miller's Sin City captivated readers, Thanos made history in the Infinity Gauntlet, seeking to please death by gathering the 6 Infinity Gems to devastate the Marvel Universe. This saga girl, who inspired the successful Avengers, Infinity War, and Endgame decades later, transcends her cinematic influence. As noted by Comic Book Wire in 2020, the story remains an essential read, whether it's to get to know Thanos, explore the Marvel cosmos, or simply enjoy a classic of the medium that has stood the test of time. The Fall of an Icon. The Death of Superman, 1992. The death of Superman in Superman 75 shook not only the world of comics, but the entire American popular culture, selling more than 6 million copies. Although DC never planned for the Man of Steel's death to be permanent, as publisher Mike Carlin confessed to Sci-Fi, "I can't believe people thought Superman was gone forever." The media frenzy and public backlash demonstrated the character's deep-rooted roots in American culture. This temporary death, which would culminate in the saga, The Return of Superman, proved that even in the era of Image Comics and Spawn, Superman was still the most important superhero of all. The Darkest Night. Batman Nightfall, 1993. Although 1993 saw the debut of Mike Mignola's iconic Hellboy, it was Batman's devastating defeat at the hands of Bane in Nightfall that marked the history of the comic. Following in the wake of the success of The Death of Superman, DC literally broke its other great hero, allowing Jean-Paul Valley Azrael to take up the mantle with a more violent style and a more radical costume. This image of Batman defeated turned out to be so powerful that years later it would influence Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight Rises, proving that some falls resonate forever. 1994. The notorious Spider-Man clone saga began. While Marvel's shown as the jewel of 1994, Spider-Man clone saga became the perfect example of how to stretch a good idea too far. What was supposed to be a 4-month story was extended until 1996, reaching 164 issues when Marvel tried to squeeze the most out of its commercial success. Despite some memorable moments, the saga is mostly remembered as a failure, so much so that Screen Rant placed it in the 3rd place of the 15 worst Spider-Man stories of all time in 2017. Her legacy is so enduring that Marvel even tried to revisit her with The Clone Conspiracy in 2016, proving that some stories, for better or worse, never die. 1995. The X-Men enter the Age of Apocalypses. While 1995 Preacher has a huge cult following in TV adaptation, Age of Apocalypse gets marks for being one of the few remarkably good Marvel stories for a solid part of the 90s. Writing about the event in 2019, CBRD Mike Fugere said, "No one could have predicted the lasting power it would have. With so many moving parts, a rewritten story, a whole new world to populate, and characters to explore, the crossover was a gamble for Marvel. It was a gamble that paid off for the company, as it remains beloved by X-Men fans to this day." The Apocalyptic Future. Kingdom Come 1996. Kingdom Come by Mark Waid and Alex Ross redefined DC Comics' vision of the future with its story of aging superheroes facing a new generation of vigilantes with no morals. Although Waid's narrative is powerful, it was Ross's hyper-realistic art that elevated the work to a legendary level. As Abraham Reisman noted in Vulture, Ross accomplished the impossible, making the supernatural seem real, allowing flights, power blasts, and body-light space stations to feel like part of our own world, setting a new standard for art in comics. A failed experiment. Heroes Reborn 1997. In the midst of financial difficulties, Marvel bet on a controversial controversial reboot in 1996 called Heroes Reborn, where iconic heroes such as Thor, the Fantastic Four, and Iron Man were transported to an alternate dimension after their battle with Onslaught. The publisher outsourced the project to the popular Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld, but despite the initial boost in sales, these quickly plummeted. By 1997, Marvel abandoned the experiment with Heroes Reborn, returning its heroes to the original continuity. Although this attempt failed, it laid the foundation for the future success of the Ultimate Universe years later. The leap into the future. DC 1,001,998. In 1998, the brilliant and eccentric Grant Morrison transported the DC Universe to the 853rd century with DC 1,000,000. A crossover that proved that sometimes the craziest ideas are the best. Unlike other events that sought to change continuity forever, this one stood out simply for being incredibly fun. As Alex Zalben pointed out on MTV, placing it in the 9th place of the 11 biggest comic book events, its value lay not in its lasting effects, but in its sheer entertaining capacity, being one of the few events that improves with each reread. The Devil's Rebirth. Guardian Devil 1999. Marvel began its resurgence with Guardian Devil, a series that brought together indie filmmaker Kevin Smith and artist Joe Quesada to reinvent Daredevil. Following DC's successful formula in the 80s, this dark and profound story signaled Marvel's commitment to winning back mature readers. As Jesse Robertson highlighted in Flickering Myth, the series not only captivated fans of the Devil of Hell's Kitchen, but served as a perfect introduction to the character, combining an elaborate narrative with an art that masterfully captured the dirty and rough essence of Hell's Kitchen. The Ultimate Reboot. Ultimate Spider-Man 2000. Marvel revolutionized its universe with the release of Ultimate Spider-Man, starting a new line that reimagined its classic heroes without the weight of decades of continuity. Of all the Ultimate titles, the Peter Parker story, which ran for 200 issues and later introduced Miles Morales, became the jewel in the crown. As Brian Robbins pointed out in Screen Rant in 2017, this version of Spider-Man came to be considered by many as the definitive one, helping to revitalize Marvel Comics in the new millennium and establishing a legacy that would last until Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. The 90s came like a tsunami of creativity and madness. Spider-Man breaks all records with 2.5 million copies sold. Superman falls to doomsday, and the real world mourns his death. Batman is broken, physically and mentally. And a titan named Thanos redefines what it means to be a villain. The comic book industry was no longer playing at being entertainment. It was becoming pure pop culture. And so, as the 20th century drew to a close, the Ultimate Universe was born. But this was not an end, it was a start. Every MCU movie you watch today, every DC series that keeps you glued to the screen, every viral meme about superheroes that you share, it all started here. In these 25 years, they transformed a few simple cartoons into the greatest cultural phenomenon of our time. The next time someone tells you that comics are just for kids, remind them, comics don't just tell stories, they change the way we tell all the stories.